Okay. So we'll talk a little bit about some patterns of use that also contribute to this baseline that we've established of overdose risk. There are some key factors that increase the risk. Mixing drugs is one, the way a drug is taken, low or reduced tolerance, using alone, and long-term use. So let's explore these ideas a little bit more. So the first major risk factor that we'll talk about for overdose is mixing drugs. The reality is that different drugs take different amounts of time to leave the body. New drugs can combine with drugs that may have been used hours earlier. Drugs may still be in the body long after a person can't feel their effects. All you'd have to do is look to police reports indicating that somebody's blown over the morning after they no longer feel drunk to note that that substance is still in the body. And the majority of overdoses involve the use of a combination of drugs. So some examples of problems with mixing drugs. One example would be with benzodiazepines that can make you forgetful. You might forget that you've taken them or forget how much you took. We also know that sleeping actually slows down the drug as it leaves the body. So just because a person can't feel the effects anymore doesn't mean the drug is not still working, and you can't sleep it off, which is a common myth. Alcohol and stimulants can both cause dehydration, which is a potentially dangerous consequence of mixing those two substances. And stimulants often wear off before depressants do. So some have experienced that when the energy drink wears off before the alcohol does, the person can become very drunk very suddenly. Okay, so the way that a drug is taken will also influence the risk level for overdose. So just so you know, and with this slide, what we're talking about is risk level for overdose. We're not necessarily talking about risk level for other things. So basically what this boils down to is that the faster a drug gets to your brain, the higher the risk of overdose. So what we know is that injection into a vein is a very fast absorption rate. It gets to the brain very quickly, and it's our highest risk of overdose. Injection into a muscle or into the skin is slightly slower. Smoking is a very fast absorption, and in fact it's a bit faster to the brain than injection into a muscle or under the skin. However, we know that you don't consume as much of a substance by smoking it at one time as you do by injecting it, so it lowers the risk slightly. We know that snorting and shafting and whooping are slower rates of absorption than what we've already spoken about, and we know that swallowing is the slowest absorption. So just in terms of risk for overdose, swallowing is the safest way to consume a substance. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about tolerance as well. When we talk about tolerance, one thing to understand is that tolerance can take some time to develop. It can take weeks or months, depending on the person and depending on the substance and depending on the patterns of use that they engage in. But it's going to reduce far more quickly, and that's across the board. That's for everyone. As little as 3 or 4 days without certain drugs can be long enough to lower tolerance to the point where there's a really high risk of overdose. So the risk of overdose is high when individuals don't take into account that their tolerance might be lower than usual, and changes in how strong or pure a drug is can lead to a person using more of a drug than they can tolerate by accident.
In my personal experience with tolerance, I just have a pretty good story. It's when I started taking Dilaudid, for example, I started taking about 4 milligrams once a day, and by the time towards the end of my use, I was taking 16 milligrams about 3 times a day. So my tolerance to that got very high. So I needed to take more of that drug to feel the same effects. One time, I went 5 days without any opiates at all, without any drugs at all, actually. And when I came back to use, I went to go use the 16 milligrams again, and then that put me in an overdose state because my tolerance, just because I had used the 16 milligrams 5 days before, 5 days later, that was way too much. I would have been fine using probably just 4 milligrams, like when I had first started using that, because my tolerance was gone.
Okay, so some reasons why someone's tolerance might be reduced. Basically what this boils down to is any reason someone might take a break. So after going through detox or a rehabilitation program, after being in custody or jail, after a period when the drug of choice isn't available, or they didn't have any money, being a new or casual user, and following a period when use of a drug is reduced or ceased for any reason. Not noted here, but just as likely as someone spending time with their family, going home for Christmas, someone deciding to take a break for health reasons, somebody going into hospital for surgery, somebody becoming pregnant. There's lots of reasons why someone might take a break.
Even taking a break on purpose to lower your tolerance.
Yep. So one of the things that's important to note is that just because someone's tolerance to one drug is high doesn't necessarily mean that will be high for a different drug. And so this concept of after a period when the drug of choice wasn't available became really important in a lot of our communities when OxyContin was delisted. And when people had to make some decisions about what they would use to treat their pain or what they would use to manage their addiction. And many switched. And just because their tolerance to OxyContin was high did not necessarily mean that their tolerance was going to be high for a different drug. And one of the results of that is a really high overdose risk. Another major risk factor for death by overdose is using alone. So the reality is that if you have an overdose and you're on your own, obviously there's no one around to respond to it. And you might not be in a state of consciousness where you can respond to it at all. That being said, overdoses can take some time to happen, and there are some who are able to recognize that they are going to experience an overdose and that they're heading in that direction. They're able to call for help or respond to it. It's certainly no guarantee, and it's a high risk factor. The other thing is that there's a community here. There's a community piece here where people support each other. And the example I often give of this is an individual whom I supported at one time used benzodiazepines as prescribed. However, one of the challenges with benzodiazepines is that it can impact your memory. So one of the patterns that this individual would get into is that she would take her benzos and she'd forget she took her benzos, so she would take them again in an attempt to follow her physician's orders. She went through quite a long time of a pattern of overdose incidents happening to her. And one of the things that we were able to do is set up an arrangement with a friend whereby the friend held on to her benzodiazepines for her and distributed them to her when she was supposed to take them. Very basic harm reduction, very basic community building, and it worked. That individual hasn't had an overdose for quite some time since that arrangement was set up.
So another major risk factor is being an experienced long-term user. It is not just new users who overdose. It is actually more likely that it's going to be an experienced or older user. There's a few reasons for this. Long-term users are more likely to mix drugs. And when I talk about mixing drugs, this could be just taking a prescription medication, if it's methadone or lorazepam, as well as any other kind of drugs that you're going to use, like going out and having some drinks or doing a few lines. There are more frequent periods of reduced tolerance due to cycles of abstinence and returning to drug use. The law of averages. The more a person uses, the greater the likelihood of overdose. And a belief that it won't happen to me. There's this sense of false confidence and that, this feeling of I know what I'm doing. So this puts you more at risk. And when I'm talking about an experienced long-term user, I'm not just talking about the age of somebody. It's that they've been using for several years. By the time I was 20 years old, I was considered an experienced long-term user, using with a man who was 50 years old who had just started using that year, who was actually the new user. So I was the one at the greater risk of overdose, and in fact, I was the one who overdosed, when we were using together.
Okay, so we've talked about what an overdose is, and we've talked about some risk factors for overdose, and we've gone through some demographics, some prescribing patterns that have led to a high overdose risk. So let's talk a little bit about how to recognize an overdose. It's important to understand how to recognize an overdose versus whether somebody's just really high. One of the key pieces to that is that if somebody's just really high, they don't actually want you to do anything about that. They'd rather just enjoy their high, and you need to be able to recognize when that person's actually at risk. So let's talk a little bit about that one in terms of depressants. So if someone's extremely high and they're using depressants, they might have contracted or small pupils. They might have slack or droopy muscles. They might be nodding out, scratch a lot due to itchy skin, have slurred speech, or be out of it. But one of the key things to understand is that they will respond to some sort of an outside stimulus. So a loud noise or some sort of pain stimulus, they will respond. It might not look like a fully conscious response, but they will be responding to that outside stimulus. Okay, if somebody's actually getting into an overdose situation though, these are some of the pieces that you'll recognize as different. The person could be awake, but might not be able to talk. So they've basically lost a core function. The body might be very limp, their face might be very pale or claiming, and you might start to see some signs of oxygen deprivation, such as their lips and fingernails turning blue or purple. The breathing might be very slow and shallow, irregular, or it might have stopped. And the heartbeat might be slow, strange, or not there at all. You might hear some choking sounds or a gurgling noise that some people refer to as the death rattle. It doesn't sound the same as snoring, even though you may also hear snoring. It's quite deep in the throat, and it can also be showing you that there might be some fluids in the throat. They might be vomiting or throwing up. They might pass out. And the key, again, is that this person is not going to respond to noise or pain. So even though they may be awake and looking at you with an outside stimulus, you might find that there's no reaction whatsoever.